All right, good afternoon, everyone. I have the slightly difficult task of the first post-lunch keynote, so I hope we can keep everyone energized and excited with some of the interesting stuff we're going to talk about today in this talk from us at Instapanel. So just a little bit of background about who we are, because we're quite a small company, so you've probably not heard of us before. We are a tech-powered, people-powered, tech-empowered research company, and our main bread and butter is running these video qual and quant studies, which sort of dive into the rich components of really understanding people, how they think, and really sort of getting this intimate snapshot into their lives through their sort of personal devices and the way they speak back to us. So this is based on real study. It's real study data that we ran specifically for MadFest. We have 332 people behind this. 30 of them were video sponsors, 300 were quant. It's a US audience, Gen Pop aged 18 to 83. And so we've got a kind of sort of like a mix of like just genuinely open sort of perspective on like ordinary people, because that's what we want to capture here. We feel like a little bit in this industry, we kind of get a bit lost in terms of what we think from a professional perspective. We really want to ground this in what ordinary people were thinking. So the methodology used, Instapanel is usually conducted on their own device. So they're usually sat at home, you know, in their truck or out in the garden or doing their morning errands. So it's usually very sort of top of mind stuff that they're thinking about as they're kind of going about their day. So it's very intimate, very from my perspective. The studies are not moderated, so they get a series of prompts and questions that they respond to sort of on the fly. So there's none of this crosstalk and observational bias that we suffer with from other methodologies. So really good for getting an honest perspective on this. And finally, we're using a mixture of AI and human-assisted codes to kind of get to the context of what's been spoken about qualitatively, so we can put some quantitative context on the qualitative data. So without any further ado, we're going to get into like the actual components of this and really take you through what we found. So the first part is about AI utilization. So we call it AKA the adoption curve. Are we there yet? Of course, famous adoption curve, where are we on this line? I think you asked different people in this audience, you put them in a very different place. So we want to explore this issue a little bit. So we started with some basic questions about AI utilization, right? Like how frequently are people using AI in their day-to-day lives and beyond? And what we're finding is that on an overall level, 60% of the panelists were doing it at least a few times a week. So this was pretty interesting on its own, but we kind of wanted to get into, is there an age split here? Is there something else going on? So we looked at this by age. So we called the first one the ski ramp, 18 to 34. You've got that bunch there of younger folks are using, up to 42% of them are using it once a day or more. So these are multiple use cases, and we've got to dig into it a little bit in a minute what those are. So it's pretty intense and pretty frequent. But what we was really surprised to find was that for 35 to 49, the usage was even higher. Now, again, there's some like clues later on as to why this is, but this is kind of the opposite of what we were expecting a little bit in terms of typical adoption with new technologies. And finally, for the 50 to 88, the U-shape. I think in some ways this was the most surprising of all, that with this group, you've got at least a quarter of them saying that they're using AI at least once a day, and about the same amount saying that they aren't using it at all, with many of these use cases falling in the middle. So our overall findings on this were sort of pretty surprising. So we kind of wanted to get into a little bit about what these use cases were, right? So we've got the frequency, but that doesn't mean much without context on what they're doing. So we asked this question, and of course we've got all of the responses back from the panelists. And so the three major themes that were sort of coming up was this research and information retrieval. That was the most common, recipes, driving directions, this kind of stuff. But the second was visual content creation. A lot of this seems like it was driven by professional stuff, not necessarily people in similar industries to creative or media production. It was being used for a wide variety of things. And the third one, communication improvement. Rephrase this, make this work better. These were the three most common themes that were coming out qualitatively with this sample. So then we were like, okay, we've got some use cases, we've got some frequency. What about the gut feelings? You know, we're all told to trust our guts, get a bit of a sense about how you feel about something. When you bring up AI, what is the sort of gut feeling that they're getting? You know, what do they say about that? And the most common was this sense that they were curious. About a third of the panelists were saying, I'm curious, I want to explore things, I want to understand a bit more. And another third was saying, well, we're excited. You know, we're excited, we're kind of really into this, we want to see how we can apply it. And the remaining quarter was skeptical. So equal parts, excitement, opportunity, and skepticism. Some of this is around capability, some of it's around other things, but a pretty warm upbringing. So our main finding we put for the first part of this was that we are so far beyond the early adoption stage with ordinary consumers, right? AI use is embedded in all kinds of behaviors with all age groups and all kinds of workflows and backgrounds. So that was a pretty interesting start. So our implication for marketers, these are a little bit of sort of like, we're just taking a punt on this. We have a team of analysts that looks at this data, looks at implications. Happy to argue about this later. Some of this data is very subjective, but this was our initial take on it. But it's become table stakes for consumers and not just for business. But these individual use cases are very unique. People get stuck in these behavior patterns that they use again and again in much more specific circumstances. So thinking about that application is very crucial. So then, of course, we go into the trust elements. We touched on this a little bit with the gut feelings, but the trust is also a very important part of this. So we asked how much you trust the output of AI. Not an abstract question like AI in general or elements of AI, but the outputs of the AI. How much of what you think coming back is true? And 49% of the panelists were saying that they trusted it, and a quarter distrusted, and a third were neutral. Now let's pay attention to this neutral stat, because this is usually balancing some nuance about how panelists look at the output. But it's a really, really interesting finding. We asked them why, specifically why do you feel like you trust or you distrust these? And the two big things that were coming back here was accuracy concerns and this idea of context-dependent trust. I'm going to play a little bit into the verbatims. Unfortunately, we don't have enough time to go for the videos, although we do have them available after if you'd like to see them and look at the sort of unfiltered results. So Anne, 49, from Maryland, she was tagged with these accuracy concerns, context-dependent trust. This is a very typical viewpoint of these panelists. She says, I simultaneously trust and distrust AI. I've seen factual inaccuracies, so it's not a perfect system by any means. So she's looked up at recaps of shows, seen that sometimes they're right, sometimes that they're wrong. So that introduced this sort of contextual level of trust. She also brings up the context of information security. Do I worry about keeping my information safe? No, I don't put that on there. So that's a really interesting takeaway from that panelist. Mindy, though, again, put some contextual dependent trust perspective on this. So she's saying one of the ways I do trust AI is how it's able to compile a lot of information into a condensed summary to better digest. So a very distinct use case where she trusts it, wherever plenty others where she would not. So we called this finding, trust AI is there, but it's conditional. Trust but verify is the watchword for a lot of these panelists when they're using AI. So in some areas, highly credible, others, not so much at all. So for marketers, if it's accepted by most but not credible in every use case, this is also clearly a moving target. If we'd asked this question 6 months ago, a year ago, we would have probably got a very different answer. So when you're looking at an AI application, whether it's in a media context, a creative context, or something like that, it's crucial to consider, will it be credible in the eyes of these particular audiences that you're targeting? The final part, the part that's probably of interest to most people here, we've got into some specific stuff about AI and advertising. Of course, was in the title of the topic that we're going to sort of dive into next. So we had to kind of start. There isn't actually a data point we could find anywhere that was consistent about how much AI is actually being used across different forms of creative production, media production. But we pulled a few of these stats from a few different platforms, and we can pretty much surmise to say that AI adoption within this industry is extremely heavy. But we can't say exactly how much. But we can assume that basically 9 in 10 are using it in some way and in some form. So then we asked panelists, have you seen AI used in advertising? This is bearing in mind that it likely is in stuff that they've seen, but have you seen it, right? And 38% said they were certain. A third said that they think they'd seen it, and about a fifth was like, oh, I'm not sure, right? Okay, that's an interesting thing. So that's quite different to what we saw earlier, where there was quite a lot of certainty around trust, right? So then we were like, well, if that's the case, how often can you tell if something was made with AI? So a bit more of a leading question, sort of getting into that gut of that there. And this is really interesting because a big chunk of people in the middle are saying that, yeah, most of the time or some of the time, I'm pretty sure that I might have seen it used. Okay, so our takeaway from this is that, frankly, a lot of AI advertising is not being noticed. It's out there, but it's not being noticed. And so the implication for marketers on this is that there are potential brand reputational minefields here, right? It's not being disclosed. It doesn't necessarily need to be. Think about this a bit like when basically the general public kind of came to understand things like retouching. When they found out about this, it starts to be a little surprising, especially for brands that have a lot of credibility and context in knowing their relationships with their consumers and feeling very authentic. So this came across to us as something that felt like a little bit of a watch-out area. It's everywhere, but not everyone's noticing it, and they don't know what to think about it. So then we get to the final component of this, which is if you knew that an ad was made by AI, would it make you trust the brand more or less? So this was, I think, the most interesting question for us, partnering as we do with a lot of creative testing and things like that. And interestingly, it's a big fat neutral, right? A huge chunk of these panelists are saying well, I don't know how to feel about that. And then equal amounts would trust the brand more or trust the brand less. I think our hypothesis was that this would be something that would make people distrust the brand. So this hypothesis was totally shattered when this is what we saw. When we broke that down by age, Again, there's that 35 to 49 group with the highest adoption rates, the ones that were most likely to trust AI. These are the ones that are more likely to be using it in their work circumstances and things like that, where we have like quite a lot of skepticism in the younger audience and a sort of more expected skepticism with the older audience. So, okay, we've determined what's going on here with trust. What's the context on this? So why would you be neutral about this? Why would you trust a brand? Why would you distrust the brand? Qualitative themes that came out here were, number one, a lack of realism. Number two, social media AI advertising. This was lots of people recalling scenarios where they'd seen it in that context specifically. And a few comments here on visual anomalies, which is everybody's bugbear, particularly our friends in production. And so some context on this. Brianna really encapsulates this kind of person, right? You know, I think I've seen AI used in advertising, but I've seen these ads when some people look a bit fake. They may have been AI generated. It's possible that they've also just been touched up so much of Photoshops that they look fake. But yeah, I'm not sure. I'd have to think about that a little more, right? So this is a really crazy situation when you've got someone that they're not quite sure if they can tell the difference between someone that's been overly touched up by a human or overly created for your AI. Pretty remarkable perspective, right? Manal said something similar. I feel like I've definitely seen more ads on TikTok and Instagram Reels where people are trying to sell you a product or a service, and you can just tell sometimes that's a deep fake or not a real person, you know? And that can be scary, right? That's not something you want to have somebody thinking about when they're looking at your brand. It's scary to me that I'm not sure this is a real person. And finally, CC here in California saying, you know, I've seen AI used for video game posters and trailers, and I'm honestly kind of neutral so long as the quality is good. But when I start to see blatant errors like limbs and fingers missing, misdrawn, I'm sort of more annoyed at it. So this is some final interesting context here. So we say in theory, AI in advertising is accepted, or at least neutral. But this is only if panelists aren't noticing it. As soon as people notice it, it's bringing up these negative impacts on brand perception because it's affecting things like quality perception and sort of activating these sort of uncertainties in panelists. So we call the implication for marketers here, excuse me, your AI is showing. You know, if it's becoming more commonplace, noticeable AI is actually becoming a hallmark of poor quality marketing, and overproduced work is being mistaken as AI. This is a very new problem to have because the barrier of entry for so many marketers has been reduced that there's a lot of cheap stuff kind of flooding the market, being noticeable and bringing down that perspective. So this is, I think, again, a really interesting finding for quality. So we also said just be aware of the potential for the uncanny valley. Nobody likes that. Well, so those were our main findings and implications for this. So obviously the first one being that we're far beyond the early adoption stage, with AI use being embedded in all levels of people's work and life. The second is that there is trust in AI, but it's conditional. Trust but verify is the watchword there. The third is that a lot of AI advertising is going unnoticed. And the fourth, of course, that if customers are aware of AI advertising, it's more likely to have a negative impact on your brand. If you have any questions, I think I've got about 90 seconds to field anything that comes through. If you'd like to see the full study, please follow that QR code. I'll just step out the way so you can actually access it. And you can take a look at the study for yourself, look at the results. We'd love for you to come over to us at the picnic table over in Seltzer Alley and challenge us on some of these or give us some more feedback or perspective. And yeah, that's our show.